So we're very fortunate tonight to have Stefan Burger with us. Stefan is an Australian naturalist with his primary focus on cactus ecology and conservation. And actually, at the CSSA convention, he won the conservation award. I just might mention that we won the first one for our rescue program many years ago. His interest is cactus and succulents since it's a young age and motivate him to visit all kinds of exotic habitats in Peru, Argentina, Mexico, Madagascar, United States, and in Chile, where he is currently based. He now facilitates ecotourism in South America and researches Chilean cactus and has a focus on what's happening with Copiapoas and Ariocisi. His program tonight is a first timer for Tucson. It's entitled Bolivian Cacti. So please welcome Stefan Burger.
Yeah, so I'm going to tell you briefly a little bit about myself, where I'm from, what I do, and then we're going to get into talking about Bolivia. Where is it? What is it like to travel there? And then we'll talk about its climate and the different cacti that grow in the different climate zones within the country. So I'm from the down under, Australia, where nothing will kill you apparently. But that's not quite the case. I mean, everywhere you go, you've something that's a little dangerous, right? You got the bears up here in North America, but Australia is full of really weird and wonderful animals. And I used to live in the city of Darwin for a couple of years, where we've got crocodiles in the river. So yeah, pretty interesting on the jumping crocodile cruise there. We've also got some really interesting endemic plants to Australia. We've got a lot of cycads and palm trees. And we've also got a baobab tree. So there's 9 species in the genus Atkinsonia. 7 of them are endemic to the island of Madagascar, 1 to mainland Africa, and 1 in Australia. And so they're actually very xeric bottle trees. You can see them growing up there on the cliff faces. We've also got these other weird things in the genus Xanther. This is an endemic genus to Australia with around 30 species in it, known as the Australian grass tree. But Australia's got no cacti in the environment, and being interested in these plants from a young age, I started a collection when I was about 10 years old. This is me with my first plants when I was around 12 actually here. Built rock gardens. My family was very supportive of my interest, and we drove around and saw a lot of cactus gardens in Australia. The climate's really perfect in Australia for a lot of desert plants. And especially South American cacti seem to do incredibly well in our climate. And you can see big gardens here with all of those really nice South American cacti and agaves. And I've got a special interest in particular in columnar cacti. And the South America's just got some really great columnar cacti examples. You've got Neo-Raymondia arequipensis there on the left, Trichocereus atacamensis in the center, and Browningia candelaris there on the right. Really, really fantastic columnar cacti, really, really old as well. It's difficult to get them to this size in cultivation, especially the Browningia candelaris. So the country of focus is Bolivia. It's a landlocked country in the heart of South America. It used to have access to the ocean, but at the end of the 1800s, Chile took that from them in the War of the Pacific, so cut off their coastal access. It's a country of around 12 million people. So, you know, it's not a very big country. And the infrastructure in Bolivia is leaves a little bit to be desired, especially when it rains in the wet season. This is me here pulling out a family along one of the roads there. We were actually stopped there for about 40 minutes because people kept on coming up the hill and kept on getting stuck in the exact same part, so we helped them get across. I traveled to Bolivia with a couple of friends from Washington State, and we were there for almost a month. So Bolivia is an incredibly poor country. I've been to a lot of different countries over the last 10 years, and Bolivia's got to be in the top two, I would say. So this is a typical living situation for a lot of the people there. They usually use what's in their backyard to survive. Here's me half naked buying some watermelons on the side of the road. This is a typical setup when you get outside of the bigger cities and remote areas, people just selling things on the side of the road to get by. And this was our typical lunchtime situation when we're out in the field. We did a lot of camping, probably about half of the trip or even 3/4 of the trip was camping. Bolivia's got a lot of diverse environments and climates, which I'll get into in a little more detail in a moment. Yeah, my friends from Washington State come down to South America a couple of times every year. Their main focus area is actually Ecuador. They're botanists and they've been describing new species from there. But we decided to try out Bolivia for a month and we just really had a great time. This is the countries, or one of the capitals. It's got two capitals technically, Sucre and La Paz, but this is what Sucre looks like. So when you get into the capital cities and things like that, it's obviously more developed, but remote areas of Bolivia are still very, very, very third world. This is what it looks like compared to the US. It's not very big, is it? It's about 9 times smaller, they say, than the United States. And this is what the Andes look like, that brown line down there on the left side of South America, which divides Chile from Bolivia and also Chile from Argentina. And the Andes are responsible for the main climate variations that you find within the country. And there's Bolivia. Right there in the center, it's on the part where they call the elbow of the Andes. Bolivia's got a lot of high altitude. The Andes puts it up into the sky pretty high, and the highest mountain there is 21,000 and a half feet. So very, very high altitude, and you feel it when you get around in a lot of these habitats. And there's also a lot of radiation. So you see there on the map on the right, that red area there is really, really high UV index, the top of the scale. So a lot of Bolivia's cacti are really well adapted to high light conditions and really harsh UV. And here's what the country looks like from the side. So you can see the Andes there on the left, and then it goes down into the savanna and even the Amazon basin, actually, to the east of the country. And the Andes also influence the temperature a lot. So you can see that the different color variations, the orange colors are more hotter, the green and blue colors are cooler. So the Andes are a really, really important factor for controlling UV radiation, temperature, and also precipitation. As you can see there too, the red area there on the west coast of South America is where the Atacama Desert is. So the Andes actually act as a rain shadow, stopping all of the precipitation coming across from the Atlantic Ocean and the Amazon basin. So in this little country, we've got a whole variety of different climates, everything from a cold desert to equatorial monsoon climates. And you can see where the Andes swoops through there, the elbow on the west of the country there. So I'm going to give you an idea. I'm going to actually break the talk down into the 4 or 5 major climate zones of Bolivia. So the first one is the Altiplano, the cold desert climate, which typically looks like this. And this is the higher altitude area of the country. And then you drop down just a little bit and you get into the subtropical highland climate, and therefore you get a different type of vegetation. You go down a little more and then you get semi-arid climate. It typically looks like this. And then when you get into the lower elevations, you get this really nice tropical savanna climate. So as you work your way down the eastern side of the Andes, you keep on passing through these different climate zones. And therefore the species that you see change a lot too. So Bolivia's got around 40 genera of cacti and around 250 species. So it's a pretty high diversity for a country with a pretty small geographic area. And I've got the main Bolivian genre listed here. So no doubt you've got some of these in your collections, especially the sulca rebuteas or the rebuteas and aloisteras, those nice little cacti, really good flowers. So we're going to start with the Altiplano, the cold desert climate, and some of the species that grow there. First one here is Cumulapuntia boliviana. It's a little Apuntioideae, clump-forming cactus. This was at almost 12,000 feet in elevation. And it just grows in this typical grassland habitat that you can see there. And when it's not flowering, they camouflage in with the grass. You can just drive right by them and you wouldn't even see them. But when they're in flower, they really jump out at you with those beautiful yellow flowers. And then higher up again, 12,500 feet, you've got another Cumulapuntia rossiana. And this is a little geophyte. See how it's retracted down into the ground there? So it's had a little bit of rain. It's a little bit hydrated and flowering, so we were lucky enough to spot it. But when it's really dry and really cold, it's underground. This is an interesting Lobivia species at almost 12,000 feet. Also really camouflages in with the grassland. So as you can see, that nice little pink flower there, if it wasn't in flower, you just don't see them. The spines just allow it to blend in with the grass. And you can see that really clear sky. It's typically like this at the high elevation in that cold desert, so a lot of UV radiation. There's a pretty diverse range of colors that you can get in the flowers. This is the Trichocereus species that we saw at also around 12,500 feet. Trichocereus bertramianus. It's been synonymized, I think, with Turihensis. The flowers are just a little bit different. But this is what it looks like through its life stage, its life cycle. It almost looks like a Neoboxbalmia when it's smaller or more lumped into Cephalocereus now. But as it gets older and taller, you'll see that the spines actually change and they become more like trichomes or hairs when they get taller and older. And that's to help protect itself from the UV radiation. Also at the high altitudes, this is at 13,500 feet, was this tiny little Aloistera steinmannii. This used to be in the genus Rebutia. I think it's jumped around to a lot of different genera. But just in the rocky crevices at these high altitudes, it finds a little microclimate there where it's able to survive. You can see my hand there next to it for size comparison. So in these rocky crevices, even at such high altitudes and such harsh climates, these smaller cacti can survive in those little microclimates. Here's another Lobivia, Pentlandii. This was at over 13,000 feet. This is almost slightly geophytic when it's younger, but it can form quite big clumps like this. This is about as big as it gets in habitat. Really spectacular flowers. We only ever saw pink flowers with this particular species. And here you can see when they're smaller how they retract and sink down into the ground, especially when they start to dry out. These these are the highest altitude dwelling cacti in Bolivia at over 14,000 feet. Lobivia maximiliana and Astrocylindropuntia flacosa. And they're often growing together. When you see one, you'll almost always see the other one. And they're growing on these rocky outcrops here amongst the moss. So when the moss builds up, more soil forms, and it's just enough usually for the little seedlings to develop. Again, they've got really dense spination and trichomes as well to help to protect themselves from the really harsh UV. And the flowers on the Astrocylindropuntia are always kind of buried down in the plant. This is as far as they emerge, so just enough to open, and then the fruits develop further down. And sometimes it's a bit of a competition to see who can survive, the moss or the cacti. the moss help the cacti to establish, but then they can try and sort of recolonize the space they've lost. All right, I'm going to draw your attention now to the Salar de Uyuni, which is the world's largest salt flat located in Bolivia. And it's going to be the last habitat I'll talk about for the Altiplano. And there's a couple of really interesting cacti species that actually grow here. The Uyuni salt flat's famous for having the Dakar Rally go through there, where they have actually set the land speed records in the Guinness World Book of Records. So it's just flat like this for miles and miles and miles and no objects to hit. So the cars are usually at risk of actually taking off instead of actually hitting something. But on the middle of these salt flats, you've got these islands. This is Isla Incahuasi, and you've got these really great Trichocereus atacamensis growing on there. The altitude's at 12,500 feet here. And not only do you have the harsh UV radiation beating down on you from above, but the reflection from the salt is also really intense. It's just like being in the snow. So these cacti have to tolerate a lot. Here's a bit of a glimpse at the temperatures. It's in Celsius, sorry, but I've got a little bit of a translation in the center there of the extremes. So the maximum temperature it ever gets in this habitat is 70 Fahrenheit. Pretty cool, and that's because of that high elevation. The Andes influencing the climate zone, and the minimum temperature is -4 Fahrenheit. So it gets pretty cold. And if you look at the relative humidity at the bottom of the Uyuni there, 9%, but it can get as low as 4%. So how do cacti survive in such cold temperatures? I mean, this happens in North America. Actually, the coldest cactus habitat is up here in North America in North Dakota, where some Escobaria species grow and also a Puntia species. It gets down to -60 Fahrenheit. I was hard pressed to find anything comparable in South America, but down in Patagonia, it can get down to -27 Fahrenheit, where some Pterocactus and Ostracactus species grow. But basically, cacti have antifreeze proteins in them, the high elevation ones, that help them to produce cryptoprotectants so they don't freeze up. Kind of like antifreeze in your radiator or your car. So, you know, if you take a lower elevation cactus to higher elevations or into colder habitats, it doesn't have these proteins. And this is usually how the cacti develop at the junction of a rock and the ground there, and that nice little protected microclimate there. And we're dropping down a little bit in elevation. When you get a bit more moisture in the Andes, you get a different type of flora appearing. So this is a nice Puya species that you can see here. And it's in this climate zone that we find Cleistocactus straussii. It's always growing on cliff faces. It was difficult to ever get really close right next to one of these species. It was always in really difficult to access locations. And this is a typical habitat for this interesting columnar cactus. It's very, very common in cultivation, but it's actually not super common in habitat. In the same area, we saw this little Alostera, and this was actually really common. We saw this in a lot of different habitats. It also worked its way down into northern Argentina too. But it also likes to find those nice little microclimates in the rocks. It's quite a variable little cactus in terms of its spines, but it more or less always has those nice orange flowers, but they can sometimes be yellow. This is a different little Lobivia species that we found growing in amongst the grass. We were lucky enough to spot a flower because this is what the habitat looks like. That tiny little cactus just disappears into the grassland. Interesting Echinopsis species growing in a big clump of the bromeliad Deuteroconia breviflora. This is sort of a nurse plant type situation. A lot of cacti develop in these clumps of bromeliad and the mossy habitats. This is an unidentified cactus species we saw. We didn't see any flowers, so we're not even really sure what genre it is. It's probably a Bolivia species or maybe a Gymnocalycium. We're not too sure. And we're also not sure about this. It looked pretty out of place. It looks like it belongs in South Africa, but it's definitely an endemic species. We found it in a really remote mountain. So it's in the Apocynaceae, we know that, and it might be in the genus Ibatia. It's a guess. There's only 3 species of from the Apocynaceae listed in Bolivia. There's a few more in Brazil, but very, very weird. The flowers, you know, stank like rotting meat, typically of that plant family. And it's a geophyte too. It had a rhizome underground, so we're still looking into that. We're not sure what it is. And these same elevations, you get this really nice Sulcorobudia rauschii, which is also really, really common in cultivation, but really not common, or at least that phenotype is not common in habitat. So this is kind of complex. I'm not going to get into it really deeply, but it's been synonymized with Rebudia canagarelii, which have both been put into the genus Weingardia. But anyway, these are smaller cacti in Bolivia. The taxonomy has been really, really difficult, and it's still not properly sorted out. But if you wanted to summarize it, most of the recent molecular studies have put Mediolabivia into Allostera and separated Allostera from Rebudia and Weingardia, apart from a few species which have been put into Weingardia. So yeah, the genetic studies at this stage are mostly focused on sorting out the genre in terms of the species, so they're not very helpful at species level. But for the time being, they've synonymized those two, the Sulcorobudia rauschii with Rebudia canagarelii. So they look really quite different, but that's just typical phenotypic plasticity. You get it in other cactus species too, so it's possible for them to have different different phenotypes, different traits, but they're well adapted to their environment. So the Sulcorobudia rauschii, the habitat's really exposed, so it's got a lot of betalain pigments. And these betalain pigments help to protect the cell nucleus from UV damage. And the Rebudia canagarelii is missing those betalain pigments, so it can get more light through, but it also grows in a more humid and shady habitat. So the different phenotypes are adapted to their environments. So yeah, that's just another view of the Sulcorobudia rauschii habitat. They can be pretty small as well. It's a very stressed environment, but you get those beautiful betalain pigments coming through. And here's an example of it in cultivation. And like I say, these are high elevation cacti and high UV exposure cacti. So they really need that light so they grow properly, because when they're missing that light, obviously they become etiolated, like the plants on the left there. They drop away the betalain pigments because they're really trying to get as much light into the cortex as they can. So this is a common problem for growing a lot of Bolivian cacti in cultivation as they get etiolated. All right, let's drop down into the semi-arid climate. Common columnar cactus here was Oreoserius celsianus. Got those beautiful trichomes on it too, and also it's another adaptation for protection against the UV. You can get different phenotypes of this as well. They commonly have straw-colored spines, but you can get some that have nice orange-colored spines, and they also tend to have brown wool as well in the orange-colored spine form. And here again, we've got Trichoserius rhodamanius growing in the same habitat. And it was also growing sympatrically with this other species, the Tachymbalensis. And you notice on the right there, I'm standing at the base of it, it's got pieces of it just breaking off because it gets so tall and lanky. And then those cuttings essentially fall on the ground and reroot. So it kind of like clones itself in habitat as well as reproducing from seed. And the spines on this, again, are very variable, like a lot of cacti. The one on the left there's kind of an interesting form, but it can change the overall appearance of the plant a lot. The geology in this area was really, really fascinating. So here's the two species growing together, the two different Trichocereus species that I just mentioned, and they have really distinctive flowering times. So the Tachymblensis was flowering while we were there, but the Wordamanius wasn't. So that's one way that they don't mix up their pollen, is to have different flowering times and maintain the species, because they definitely would produce hybrids. Can you see this cactus? Kind of blends in with the lichen and the cyanobacteria. This little Blossfeldia lilliputana it's known as the world's smallest cactus, you know. So when it's like that in habitat, but when you get into cultivation, it can get quite a lot bigger, obviously. But it also grows in these rocky crevices and this little microclimate with lichens and bacterias. And this little cluster was literally growing on the side of a rock. So the lichens and the cyanobacteria are essentially the substrate. It's just enough to collect a little bit of silt, a little bit of dust, and it's seriously just growing on the side of a rock. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Another technical term that I'll bring up is poikilohydric. So Blossfeldia lilliputana is poikilohydric, just like lichens, which means it's only as hydrated as the environment allows it to be. So it can become really, really dehydrated and become like as flat as a pancake there. And it can be in that state for up to 2 years without dying. So it's a really, really unique little cactus. Lobivia cinnabarina, this was near Sucre. Really, really stunning flowers. We were lucky to catch it in flower, actually. It's always special to see a cactus in flower in habitat, because you know the flowers only last for a day or two at the most, and quite often in habitat the flowers get eaten by birds or lizards, so it's always a really special thing. All right, let's drop down into my favorite area in Bolivia. Was this habitat, the tropical savanna climate. Not only were there cacti, but obviously a diversity of a whole other bunch of stuff. It was really, really fascinating. We couldn't spend enough time there, and it's somewhere that we're definitely going to go back to. It was full of aroids in the jungle there, tree ferns as well. This was just as we dropped down kind of almost into the Amazon basin. Looks like a lot of the tree ferns we've got in southern Australia in the genus Dickia, but this is a completely different genus. But the convergence is pretty remarkable. It looks almost exactly the same. And this is an image I got with my drone, so you can see how they sort of form their own colonies in the forest. Bolivia's got a pretty high diversity of passion flowers too. There's about 12 species that are endemic to the country. And a whole lot of orchids as well, all over the place. There's some terrestrial orchids, lithophytic ones, epiphytic ones. A lot of bromeliads too. On the right, there's a Guzmania species. And a whole heap of other really nice exotic flowers. Here's a couple of Bomaria species. So these are lilies, actually, and they've got a rhizome underground. And there's several species which are also endemic to Bolivia. There's a begonia on the left there, and in the middle we've got an epiphytic cactus, a Ripsala species, more bromeliads. The epiphyte diversity was really, really high in this area. Any time that you look up in the tree canopy, there was something growing up in there. This is probably Ripsalis species, but there's another genus called Pseudo Ripsalis, and to be honest, I couldn't tell them apart. Another epiphytic cactus, Phyphora. This is a genus I'd never come across before in habitat until going to Bolivia, but you can also get this genus in Argentina. And this is its typical growth habit. We never saw one growing on the ground or on the side of a rock. It was only in the tree canopy. But it's also kind of a dry environment up there. You can see the lichens have also colonized the bark, so it's also kind of a xeric habitat. This was another really bizarre cactus we came across, Trichocereus arboricola. It's one that I've never seen in cultivation before. And it only grows up in the tree canopies. So all of the other Trichocereus terrestrial, but then you've got this weird epiphyte form. And there it is on the genetic study. So the genus Trichocereus is also really controversial, but I'm not gonna get into that. But apparently, if you include two species of Harrisia in there, it's a good genus. But they've kind of lumped it into Leucostelli now or Echinopsis. It's complicated. Looks dangerous, but it's not really. Bolivia's got a lot of tarantulas. Really common to see these in Peru as well, crossing the road. But the temperature and the barometric pressure and everything's got to be just right. The conditions have to be just right for them to come out. This is the Deuteraconia species that we saw. Another bromeliad. Lots of terrestrial bromeliads through this whole habitat. This is Bromelia sera. This is very, very common. This is also in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay. This is an interesting tillandsia species. So you can get xeric tillandsias, which are usually more common in cultivation, but then you can also get these tank bromeliads, tank tillandsias that accumulate water in the center of them. So this is actually a tillandsia. And it's growing on the side of cliff faces there and up in tree canopies. Absolutely massive. And the top of this mountain peak here is just littered with those big Tillandsia australis. We came across this Jatropha macrocarpa. Now, the genus Jatropha, you have to be very, very careful with a few of the species, and this is one of them. This has a really, really toxic exudate, so you got to be careful not to break the skin on it or break the leaves, and definitely don't eat any of the plant parts on this. But a beautiful, like, pachycol succulent. Echinopsis pamperucii, this was really, really common all through these areas. It was growing quite often on the forest floor, on road cuts, on the sides of cliffs. I think it might have a nocturnal flower. I'm not sure. We saw a lot of it, but we never saw a flower on it. Lots of dead flowers, fruits. This Echinopsis did, however, have diurnal flowers, and we saw a lot of blooming plants of this. Lots of color variation too. Anything from orange to salmon colored to red, even white. And it also typically grew with the moss as well. Gymnocalycium flancii. This was really common in the southern part of Bolivia. It also goes into Argentina. But there's not a whole lot of Gymnocalycium diversity in Bolivia. It's mostly in Argentina. This is a really, really rare Cleistocactus species in habitat. This is so common in cultivation, but the habitat of this it's almost extinct in habitat, actually. It has a very, very narrow distribution zone. And it's just growing on cliff faces in the jungle. And those cliff faces, even though it's in a more humid environment, they're still quite dry, and you get other xerophytes there. You got some xeric tillandsias and little Parodia species. But this is what it looks like growing above the forest canopy. And here it is with a lot of tillandsia. Another really rare Bolivian Cleistocactus is subspecies Cola de Mono, which means monkey tail in Spanish. It was common to see this in people's gardens and growing alongside of the road. They make these hanging baskets out of plastic bottles and sell them to anyone driving past. But yeah, also has a very, very narrow distribution zone. And these two species are super weird. There's three species actually of clyster cactus which have this weird kind of hanging form. So they're, you know, you'd call them lithophytes, and they just grow on the cliff faces. And this is what it looks like in habitat. And it's also growing with the Tillandsia australis, which is generally what you know, is the provider of its habitat, as well as other Selaginella and moss and stuff like that. Yeah, but this is a pretty cool clyster cactus. They used to have it in the genus Hilda Winter, and a lot of people still use that, but it is definitely a clyster cactus. And even when you get it in cultivation, it just wants to hang down just by nature. So it's so well adapted to growing on those cliff faces, it doesn't know what else to do when you even get it out of habitat. It needs a hanging basket. And yeah, it's kind of unusual because a lot of shrubby or columnar cacti always try to grow up. But this clyster cactus always tries to grow down for whatever reason. So you can see here when cacti fall over the edge of a cliff face, due to plant tropisms like phototropism or gravitropism, they try to grow upwards, usually. We also saw Pereschia, a really, really weird cactus genus that doesn't look like a cactus at all, but technically is. Interesting shrubby, yeah, Pereschia diaz bramorana. Has really small flowers. These were really, really tiny. You could see the size comparison. Oh, yeah, they're next to my hand. Has these little berries. All cactus fruit is edible. Some of it's more tasty than others. And the interesting thing about this Pereschia, I got this image offline from the Kew Botanical Gardens website, is it has a big taproot, big napiform taproot. There's a few Pereschia species that have this characteristic, which is, I personally found it really interesting. Different Pereschia. Pereschia is a one exception to the rule in cacti in the photosynthesis mechanism. Cacti usually use CAM photosynthesis or crassulian acid metabolism, but these use C3 photosynthesis, which is the typical photosynthesis pathway. Well, they actually technically have both. So when the conditions are right, when it's more humid, they have the C3 pathway, and then when it's dry, they change to the CAM, which is pretty interesting. I'll just briefly go into this, but basically the genus Pereschia was split up into three genera in 2016. So all of the actual Pereschia are only located in the Andes. And then you've got this other genus called Rhodocactus, which is only in Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. And then in the northern hemisphere, you've got Leuenbergia. So it's just something to be aware of. I won't go into that. That's the phylogeny of it all. This was one of my favorite cacti that we saw, Vatricania guntheri, and they used to have this synonymized with Espostoa, but it's really, really far from all of the other Espostoa. If it was, it would be the only one in Bolivia. All the others are north of Lima, like 1,500 miles as the crow flies away. So it doesn't make a lot of sense geographically, and there is a genetic study that separates it as a monospecific genus. So it's got a lateral cephalium, which is the fertile part of the cactus, where the flowers and the fruits are produced from. So here's what it looks like through its life stage. You know, when it's more juvenile, maturing, and when it's got the cephalium. Well, it might be a pseudocephalium. There's sort of a small technical difference between the two, but there's an interesting study by Ruud Gorelek in the Hasseltonia magazine back in 2019 where he talks about it. But the conclusion was he doesn't know if it's a cephalium or a pseudocephalium. So didn't seem to be much help. But anyway, in the same area under the in the forest under the forest canopy was this Hericea species, and I just found it to be so weird. It never grew upright. It never grew truly decumbent. It just sort of kind of, I don't know, looped its way through the habitat. So it tends to kind of grow along the ground flat, and then it will shoot up new offsets. And when they get too tall, it kind of just falls down again. But it was really, really common through this type of scrubland. Interesting tubercles. And another weird cactus that grew on the forest floor was this Opuntia pubescens. It's really tiny. This is as big as it gets. This is a typical example next to my hand there on the forest floor, but we didn't catch it in flower, which would have been interesting. Well, I was asked to talk a little bit about conservation. So this is going to be the final part of the presentation. Basically, a lot of cacti are really at risk, around 31% of cacti. This is a bit of an older statistic now. I think it's much higher than this, but our cacti in habitat are in trouble, and basically a lot of them have a really narrow distribution range, and they're really vulnerable to habitat destruction or climate change, mining operations too, and poaching and demand from the horticultural trade. So I'll talk about the poaching issue briefly. Basically, in cultivation, we tend to hold plants in an ornamental value. We put a price tag on them, but we have to keep remembering that they have an ecological value too, and they have a purpose to serve in habitat. The flower of a plant is the base of the food chain. The pollen is rich in protein, the nectar glands are full of sugar, and that's where it all begins. The insects come and eat that, the lizards come and eat the insects, and so on. But what we're noticing, especially with the genus Copiopoa, is there's a lot of these habitat plants are appearing online. And this is what they look like. Bare-rooted. This is what a typical Copiopoa looks like from habitat. Copiopoa columna alba and cinerea are definitely the most sought after ones. So you'll often see them sold like this, bare-rooted, without roots. Which is highly unusual. A cultivated plant always has the roots on it. Another big issue is, of course, climate change, which I mentioned. These are habitat photos from Chile. There's a couple of areas which I'm keeping really close eye on and taking photographic evidence every few years. But as you can see here, everything in the habitat's dead. And these are plants that are adapted for xeric conditions. And we've got multiple different plant families here. We've got cacti, we've got bromeliads, we've got plants from the Solanaceae, and they're all, succumbing to climate change. And we're talking about billions of plants. This is one of the habitats of Copiopoa solaris. Every single plant's dead. And we're literally talking, hundreds and thousands of plants that have died within the last, this habitat, I've got photographs of it from the late 60s, from a friend from Chile, and also in Frederick Ritter's Cacti of South America. He's got photos from this habitat in the 80s, and they were still mostly alive. About 80% of the habitat was still alive, but you go there now and it's completely the opposite. So yeah, climate change is definitely having a big impact in certain areas. I'll just briefly go through this, but South Africa's really, really copping it, or Southern Africa in general. Plants from Namibia, Tanzania, etc. are being poached by the millions. Pachyform plants from Africa. And social media has really kind of accelerated this whole process. Now with the internet, it's so easy for people to be connected internationally, and locals get in on it, and whatever plant's kind of trending at the time just tends to get dug up. The Pachypodium species are really targeted. And then they end up in little kind of niche pop-up stores like this, quite often in it's not just the Asians who are doing it. They usually cop a lot of the blame, but the Europeans are in on it. I'm sure they get up here as well. So, there's a lot of things that we can do. Seed banking is a really important one. They're doing this internationally, and they're really, really focusing on it now in South Africa to preserve some of that genetics there. We can increase the size of national parks. We can even create private reserves for narrow point endemics that are outside of national parks. Patrolling and surveillance is kind of difficult, but cameras can sometimes deter people from taking plants. But I think the biggest thing we can do is harsher penalties, you know? I mean, it's happening in South Africa, you know, people are going to jail for taking plants, you know, it's illegal. And the fines are pretty big, so, you know, that's one way to deter people from poaching. And just education, general education about the topic. So the biggest barriers always seem to be funding. You know, it always seems to be about money, unfortunately, and not a lot of funding goes towards conservation. And we also need knowledgeable people to volunteer their time to help with all of these kinds of projects. Another big difference is cultural differences and language barriers, of course. We're talking about international issues and also corruption. I know in Chile, even with this problem, I mean, the agricultural department, police officials, people working on ports, I mean, you know, you can't hide from or try and pretend that corruption's not involved. These plants are still getting out of these countries somehow. Oh, that's just some of the most... one thing that we've been working on, something that we feel like we can do, is create educational material. So we've been publishing these infographics online, helping to explain to people, you know, just generally about the problem of plant poaching, because people usually associate it with animals. They've all heard about animal poaching, but they kind of don't understand what plant poaching is. So the main thing is just to educate people about it, tell them how to make more ethical decisions when it comes to purchasing plants. And we've gone ahead and translated these infographics into multiple different languages. I'll just leave you with this example of Copiapoa and alba. Is just, you can apply a lot of these same principles to different habitat plants, but the main thing to look for is damaged roots or no roots at all. It's highly unusual to be sold a succulent plant that doesn't have a root system. But this is a seed-grown Copiapoa alba from this exact same habitat that I'm showing you, so there's a lot of differences. Cacti and succulents are usually pretty beaten up in habitat, pretty weathered, they've got corking, and usually what happens when they form cork tissue is that bacteria and algae colonize it and turn it black. That doesn't happen in cultivation. The spines, the same thing happens. They usually turn black from the algae and bacteria. And damaged spines too. They're worn away in habitat, and usually with transportation, the spines get damaged. So they're all things to look for. Oh, this is what the seed bank looks like in Chile. I've been working with them a little bit on this, helping them to collect some of the most endangered cactus species in Chile. And this project's been funded by the Kew Botanical Gardens. And so, yeah, we go and collect the seeds, or they go and collect the seeds and they dry them out in silica gel. And then they put them in the freezer. They keep them down to, I think it's about -4 Fahrenheit. And so when the seeds are dry and cool, they tend to last a lot longer, sometimes even up to 50 years. If you'd like to know a little bit more about what I do, you can look me up at cactusexplorer.com, send me an email at cactusexplorertours@gmail.com. I do habitat tours in Chile and Mexico primarily. Oh, those are the typical itineraries that I have. They usually last from anywhere from around 15 days to 11 days. But you can look me up online to get more info about that. I'm on social media, Facebook, Instagram. Thank you very much.